Let's go back to 2008. Your enterprise most likely had Oracle Identity Manager or CA Identity Manager or maybe a custom IGA tool. And you have spent 24 months implementing it. You have connectors to Active Directory, your SAP system, and most likely your mainframe. And your provisioning team is proud. And honestly, they should be. And then someone somewhere in the company signs a contract with Salesforce. Now you just identified that Salesforce has no connector with your IGA system, or your IGA system has no connector with Salesforce. So no big deal. Custom integration is needed. That would be 12 weeks of work, a statement of work likely from a system integrator, and a connector that works until Salesforce changes their API. Then comes Workday, and then comes ServiceNow, and then comes Box, and so on and so forth. The IGA tools of that era were real, they were powerful, and they solved the problem for the systems they were built for. IGA at that time was still mostly a compliance lever. But SaaS didn't care about your connector framework. Every new application was its own island. Every integration was a one off. And the number of SaaS application in the average enterprise was about to go from 10 to 100. Now that gap between the on-premise word the old tools were built for and the SaaS word that was arriving fast is what SCIM was born to close. Welcome to the Identity Navigator. I'm your host Rohit, and today we go deep on SCIM. But let's rewind to understand what the word looked like before SCIM existed, because we cannot appreciate a solution without first sitting in the pain of the problem. So we go around the same timelines in the mid 2000s, right? SaaS is exploding. Salesforce has figured out that you don't need to install software to use software. What a revolutionary thought. Google Apps, which would ultimately become Google Workspace, is making noise. Workday is coming for HR, and Box is coming for file storage, and ServiceNow is coming for ITSM. Every single one of these applications is an island, and we all know that islands are terrible for enterprise security because every island has its own idea of what a user looked like. Some systems stored first name and last name as separate fields. Others stored a display name as a single string. Some had departments. Others called it division. And somebody else called it cost center. An email, was it the username? Was there a separate username? Was it case sensitive? Nobody really agreed on anything. So what did the IGA vendors of the time did? They built transformation and translational layers. Gorgeous, elaborate, drag and drop mapping screens where you could say things like take the value from department underscore code, run it through this lookup table, concatenate it with the first three characters of cost center, convert to lowercase, and that becomes the department field in the target system. And it worked. And honestly, it still works. But until the source system changed their field name, or the lookup table got out of date, or someone in HR decided that engineering should now be called technology. And suddenly, half your users were landing in a department called null. The transformational layer was essentially a full time job dressed up as a configuration screen. Some enterprise had people, actual human beings with job title, whose entire role was maintaining attribute mapping logic across systems. So what did everyone else do? The people who couldn't afford the enterprise IGA suite, they wrote scripts. Now, honestly, the large enterprises, the ones running OIM or CA, weren't doing this with a script. They had connectors, they had workflows, they had transformational layers, and they had spent millions to solve exactly this problem. But here is what happened. SaaS moved faster than the connector catalog. I kid you not. Sometimes when I used to work on OIM implementations, it probably took from 3 to 6 months in setting up all the environments. 5 environments and non-prod systems and prod systems and databases and procurements. It almost took 3 to 6 months. Can you imagine it in today's world? And then just connecting to HR system and Active Directory was probably another couple of months. So before even one user got terminated, which was the lowest hanging use case, you have probably already spent a couple of $1 million and have been doing it for the past 7 to 8 months. And that was the reality of the time. But SaaS moved faster than the connector catalog. Every new application that didn't have a certified connector became someone's weekend project. And in mid-market companies, the one who couldn't justify a seven-figure IGA implementation, his scripts were absolutely the provisioning engine. These scripts were glorious and they were terrible. PowerShell or Python or shell scripts held together with the institutional knowledge of one engineer who, by the way, left the company 3 years ago. And these scripts mostly ran on cron jobs, usually at 2 a.m., usually on a server nobody touched because everyone was afraid that if you looked at it wrong, it would stop working. And these servers always had a name, something like legacy-prov-01 or legacy.prov.02. And hopefully, and most likely, there was a sticky note on it that said, do not restart. And the termination problem that cut across everyone, OIM shops included, because marked as terminated in the HR system was never the same as access revoked in every SaaS application. The IGA tool covered what it knew about. Everything outside that perimeter, the new Slack workspace, the Zoom account someone provisioned directly, the GitHub org the dev team set up without telling IT, none of that got cleaned up. The world was divided in two groups, and neither of them were perfect, but neither of them were wrong. So these two groups were script and CSV word. SMB and mid market who couldn't afford OIM or CA, enterprise who had IGA for core systems but had SaaS apps outside that perimeter, and contractors, temps, non employees, even OIM shops often had gaps. And what OIM and CA were actually doing, they were solving the problem for sanctioned connector supported systems. But the connector catalog didn't keep pace with SaaS growth. And the cost and complexity meant sprawl happened around the IGA tool, not through it. Studies, studies from this era consistently found that enterprises had 30 to 40% of SaaS accounts belonging to people who had already left, ghost accounts sitting there quietly. Now, this is not a theoretical security problem. That is how former employees retain access to Salesforce 6 months after their last day. And that specific gap, the SaaS parameter that existing tools couldn't reliably cover, is what a group of engineers decided needed a standard answer. And that standard answer became SCIM. Now, SCIM didn't emerge from a vacuum as we have seen. And understanding where it come from will help you understand why it's built the way it is. So this year was 2011. A group of engineers and architects, primarily from large SaaS companies, started having conversations about a shared problem. And this is why I believe in the community information sharing across all the security domains. Everyone was building custom integrations, everyone was reinventing the wheel, everyone was spending engineering time on plumbing that had nothing to do with their core product. Salesforce, Google, Ping Identity, they were among the early voices. The conversation was essentially, can we agree on a common way to represent users, groups, and the operation you do on them? So the first version, SCIM 1.0, came out in 2011 under the IETF, or the Internet Engineering Task Force. For those who aren't familiar, the IETF is the body that gives us the standards that runs the internet. Think HTTP, SMTP, OAuth, DNS. These all went through the IETF. So when SCIM landed in the IETF, it was being taken seriously. Now SCIM 1.0 was a start, but like most 1.0, it was rough. It had schema inconsistencies, some ambiguities or in behavior, and it didn't have broad enough adoption to prove itself. So what happened next is everybody would guess it. There came SCIM 2.0, which was remarkably better than SCIM 1.0. This was published in 2015 as RFCs 7642, 7643, and 7644. And yes, I am going to break those down because these actually matter. If you have time, I would really advise you to go back and read them. This is not an academic RFCs, they really are much nuanced. And I think every identity engineer could benefit from reading them. So SCIM 2.0 was much more complete and much more coherent with specifications. RFC 7642 is the definitions, overview, concepts, and requirements document. Think of it as why we are here document. It explains the problem space and the design goals. 7643 is the core schema. This is the data model. What does a user look like? What does a group look like? What attributes exist? What are their types and cardinality? And then 7644 is the protocol. This is how you talk document, the HTTP method, the endpoints, the filtering system, the pagination model, the bulk operations. You look at this flow, I'm absolutely mesmerized with this. And that is why it's easy to remember 76, 42, 43, and 44. The definitions, the core schema, and the protocol. Going from why are we here to this is the data model, and then this is how you talk. So three RFCs, a very deliberate separation of concerns. And that separation, concept, schema, and protocol, is actually quite elegant. Now here is something important to understand about SCIM 2.0. It is built on two technologies that by 2015 were already well understood. These two technologies were JSON and REST. And this was a very intentional choice. The predecessor to SCIM in spirit, not in direct lineage, was something called as SPML, Service Provisioning Markup Language. I personally loved the name SPML. Service Provisioning Markup Language just made sense to me. SPML was an OSS standard from the early 2000s, so much ahead of its time. It used XML, it was SOAP based, and yeah, I kind of see why it was not popular. But there is a reason you have probably never heard of SPML. It was technically capable, but practically so painful. It was XML heavy, complex to implement, and at a time when web services were still trying to figure themselves out, it was just such a pain to implement. Now, SCIM 2.0 thankfully learned from that. JSON is human readable, widely supported, and every programming language has a JSON library. and REST is the lingua franca of web APIs by 2015. By building on these foundations, SCIM dramatically lowered the barrier to implementation. The other major improvement in SCIM 2.0 was schema extensibility. The core schema defines a set of standards attributes, but SCIM allows you to define extension schema, namespaced attributes that are specific to your use case. So if your company has a custom attribute called clearance level, you can add it to the SCIM schema without breaking the core script. But as with all good things, or with most good things, adoption wasn't instantaneous. 2015 to 2018 was the slow burn. A handful of major identity providers like Okta, Azure AD or Entra ID, OneLogin started building SCIM support. A handful of major SaaS apps started building SCIM endpoints. And then something happened. The pandemic. It was a catalyst for so many different things related to identity, and it was a catalyst for this identity protocol as well. As you all know, the world went remote overnight. The companies that were used to an on-premise Active Directory and VPN-based access suddenly found themselves needing to provision and deprovision employees at scale across dozens of SaaS applications with no physical office to anchor anything. So without going into it, you understood what pandemic changed, and this demand for automated provisioning exploded. And SCIM, which had been steadily maturing, was ready. Thankfully so. Okta's SCIM integration catalog grew dramatically. Entra ID SCIM support deepened. ServiceNow, Workday, GitHub, Slack, Zoom, all of them either built or improved their SCIM endpoints in this period. And that is why, I always feel like these companies are trying to do the right thing in most of the cases. But today in 2026, SCIM is table stakes. If you are a SaaS vendor selling to enterprise and you don't have an SCIM endpoint, you should be and are most likely to lose deals. Full stop. Okay. So let's get a little technical here. And not not the kind of technical where I look like a crazy person, hopefully not. But the kind of technical where by the end you could explain SCIM to someone on a whiteboard. Okay, let's see if I can make it happen. So SCIM stands for System for Cross-Domain Identity Management. So let's parse that name. System. It's not just a data format, not just an API style. It's a complete system. Cross-domain is the whole point. Different systems, different identity stores, different vendors maybe, and my likely. And then identity management, user, groups, and operations that keep them in sync. So at its core, a SCIM is a REST API specification for managing users and groups. That's all. That's it. That's the elevator pitch. But if we go one level deeper, a SCIM defines a resource model. There are two core resources, users and groups. And a user has a standard set of attributes like username and name and email, phone numbers, addresses, title, department, active, extended, whatever else. And an ID like an identifier assigned by the SCIM service provider. And it also might have an external ID, the identifier from the authoritative source system. So this last distinction in the standard set of attributes for the user, the external ID versus just the ID, is important and often confused. The external ID is your identifier. It's the ID from the upstream system that's pushing data. So if Workday is your HR system and Workday generates a unique employee ID, say employee 00429, that becomes the external ID in the SCIM payload. Now, the second attribute, the ID, is the target system's identifier. When you create a user in Okta via SCIM, Okta generates its own internal ID, some opaque string, and returns it back. That is the ID. And on subsequent request, you use that ID to refer to that user in that system. This is a clean, well thought out pattern. It acknowledges that identities exist in multiple systems and that each system has its own namespace. Okay, so we now understand what is the elevator pitch for SCIM, and for external ID and ID and things like this. Now, let's talk about the protocol layer for a second. What you actually do with SCIM. So SCIM uses standard HTTP method mapped to CRUD operations. So post to users creates a user, get to users slash ID reads a user, and then puts is full replace, and patch is partially update, and delete is deleting a user, right? Very intuitive. And for groups, post will create a group, and patch to the groups slash ID will add or remove members, and delete will delete a group. So there is also a get with the user's endpoint with filtering. And this is where SCIM's filtering syntax comes in. So you can actually say things like uh, get on user's endpoint and filter is equal to username equals Rohit, or get users filter equal to email.value equals Rohit at company.com and active equal true. So SCIM has its own filter syntax, not SQL, not GraphQL, but it has its own thing. It supports things like EQ, that's equal, or any, or CO, that means contains, or SW starts with, or EW that ends with. PR, presence, GT, LT, GE, LE, and it also supports logical operator like and, or, and not. It's reasonably expressive for the use case, super simple to learn. It will probably take you less than 30 minutes to understand the SCIM's filtering syntax. And honestly, you don't even need to learn it. You just need to know that something like this exists out there. Now, patch in SCIM is worth a special mention because it's different from how you might think about patch in general REST APIs. So, SCIM patch uses a structure called as PatchOp, short for patch operations. And each patch request contains an operation array where each operations has an op field like add, remove, or replace. So it's like your operations adding, removing, replacing. It has a path field or path field which has a SCIM attribute path, possibly with a filter, and then the value field, which is the new data. So you can use the patch on the group resource to add a user to a group. Or if you want to deactivate a user without deleting them, your op or the operations could be replaced and path could be active and value would be false. So it would replace and the value of active would be set as false. That's it. With one patch, you can deprovision users across the system or user across the system. There is also a service provider config endpoint. This is the SCIM discovery endpoint where a service provider is the system receiving SCIM calls, declare what it supports. Does it support filtering? Does it support bulk operations? Does it support patch or only put? What does it really support? Does it support ETAG for optimistic concurrency? So this is genuinely useful. Before you implement an integration, you should always query service provider config and understand the capabilities of the system you are talking to. In practice, it is underused because implementations are inconsistent, but the intent is good. And then there is the endpoint, schemas endpoint, an endpoint where the service provider lists all the schema it understands, including extensions. You can query this to see the full data model, including customer or custom enterprise attributes. Now, let's spend some time on something that trips people up constantly. And give it a second here. Like, I want you to think through this. What is the difference between provisioning and SCIM? So we really need to understand this. A SCIM is a mechanism for provisioning. Provisioning is the outcome. They are not the same thing. So let's understand with that. Just like provisioning, it's like getting a package delivered to your house. That's provisioning. A SCIM is like UPS, not the only delivery service, but a very standardized, well-known one that shippers and receivers have agreed to support. Right? For people who are not familiar with the UPS, think like provisioning is like getting a package delivered to your house, and SCIM is like FedEx. So you could use any other service that's native to your country. It's like a vendor specific API, or you could use a person driving a van with no tracking system. That's like a flat file integration. All of them delivers package. A SCIM is just the standardized courier. So provisioning is in the identity context is the lifecycle management or digital identities, right? So all of us understand provisioning encompasses joiners, movers, and leavers, where joiner is when somebody is joining the organization, movers when somebody's or someone's role changes, and leavers is when someone leaves. Their access needs to be removed. So this is what we typically call as the joiner mover leaver workflow, or JML for short, right? And arguably, this is the most critical function in enterprise identity. Getting GML wrong is how you fail audits. It's how you get breached. It's how you violate least privilege principles. Uh, if I think deeply about it, getting GML and your conditional access policies wrong are potentially two biggest landmines that identity team creates. Right, but I don't want to digress from the topic of GML. So now within provisioning, there are different methods. You could have manual provisioning where somebody submits a ticket and human creates the account. You could have script based provisioning, like the do not restart server era we talked about. You could have IGA based provisioning, using an sale point or savient or something like that to orchestrate provisioning based on rules and policies. You could have IDP based provisioning, using an identity provider like Okta or Entra or Ping to push identity changes to connected applications. And this is where SCIM fits most naturally today. Also, you could have an HR driven provisioning. So treating the HR system like your Workday or SuccessFactor or Bamboo HR as the authoritative source of truth for identity, and having changes that cascades downstream. And SCIM is increasingly used here too, particularly in the Okta Workday and Entra Workday integration, right? So think about it. Let's repeat this a little bit here. Provisioning is SCIM is a mechanism for provisioning. Provisioning is the outcome. Now, how many different type of provisioning exist? We have manual, script, IGA based, IDP based, and HR driven. And SCIM most likely fits most naturally into an identity provider based provisioning, or now increasingly in HR driven provisioning. Okay, so when someone says we use SCIM for provisioning, what they typically mean is their identity provider, like an Okta or Entra or Ping, is configured to push user lifecycle events to a target application via the SCIM protocol. That's simple. Now the flow looks like this typically. A new employee is created in Workday. Workday notifies the IDP through its own integration. Uh, The IDP provisioning engine evaluates the user's attribute against provisioning policies. The IDP pushes a SCIM post to the user's endpoint to each application the users should have access to. Each application creates the users and returns the system assigned ID. The IDP stores that mapping, like user X in my system corresponds to ID Y in this application. And now future attribute changes trigger SCIM patch request, and when the user is terminated, the IDP sends either a patch to set active, false, delete, something like this. You got the point. That is automated provisioning via SCIM, which is clean, auditable, and fast. And when it works, it's genuinely beautiful. Now, one more distinction that is worth making here is about authentication versus provisioning. And you would be like, Rohit, really? Are you really going to differentiate authentication versus provisioning to us? And I would. Now, because there are completely separate concerns that often gets conflated. So authentication is, can this person get in? So think about like the IDP based provisioning is happening here, right? And that is where most people get confused. Authentication, as you all know, is, can this person get in? It's about verifying identity at login time. This is where SAML and OIDC live, SSO, federation, identity. Provisioning is, does this person accounts exist in the system? And does it have the right attribute and access? This is where SCIM lives. So think through this deeply. You can have SSO without SCIM. The user logs in via SSO the first time, and the application creates an account on the fly through through a process called as just-in-time provisioning, or JIT. But JIT has a problem. It doesn't handle deprovisioning. When someone leaves, JIT doesn't allow to go delete their account. They just stop logging in. The account lingers. These are the type of distinctions that we need to understand to work in our any capacity within the identity ecosystem. You could be an identity analyst, you could be an identity engineer, you could be an identity architect, you could be an identity leader, you could be a business analyst or identity analyst or whatever, right? But we need to understand these distinctions. Now you can also theoretically have SCIM without SSO. Think about it for a second. Can you theoretically have SCIM without SSO? Yes, though this is much rarer and usually transitional. So think about SCIM and SSO and just in time and create that mental picture in your head. So in practice, the gold standard is SSO plus SCIM. SSO handles authentication, SCIM handles the account lifecycle. Together, they give you complete control over who can access what from day one to their last day. Now, uh, let's make this a little bit more practical because I get asked this question all the time. When does SCIM become worth caring about? My honest answer is, if you have more than 50 employees and more than 10 SaaS applications, SCIM should already be on your radar. If you have more than 200 employees and you are not talking about SCIM, you have a problem brewing. So let us talk through some concrete signals, and these are the moments when a SCIM goes from now nice to have to we need this like yesterday. Okay, so you get an audit finding, or worse, you get a breach, and the investigation reveals that the former employee still had active accounts in 3, 5, 8 SaaS applications. Bonus points for irony: one of those applications is your security platform. This signal is unfortunately how many organizations first get serious about provisioning. They learn the hard way. If you are listening to this and you haven't had that horror story yet, consider this your warning shot. The second signal is the IT ticket backlog. New employees are waiting 2, 3, 5 days for access to the tools they need. Like, really, dude, your IT team is drowning in provisioning tickets. Please create an account in Slack, Salesforce, ServiceNow, Zoom, GitHub, Confluence, Jira, Box, and for Jane Doe who starts Monday. If your IT team is doing this manually for every new hire, for every mover, you are spending human capital on something that can be automated. That's not a process problem, which everybody likes to say, this is our process. That's not a process problem. That's an architecture problem. And the third signal is your compliance, the SOC 2, the ISO 27001, the HIPAA, the PCI DSS, the FedRAMP. Every one of this framework has requirements around access management. They want evidence that access is granted based upon business need, that it's reviewed regularly, and that it's revoked promptly upon termination. Promptly in many frameworks means within 24 hours, sometimes sooner. You cannot manually hit that SLA across 15 SaaS applications. You need automation and you need SCIM, right? The fourth signal probably is someone in your organization does a shadow IT audit and they discover that the company has subscription to 120 different SaaS applications, many of which the IT team didn't even know existed. And when they start looking at users' account in these systems, they find a graveyard of ex-employees. This is increasingly common. The average enterprise today uses somewhere between 100 to 250 SaaS applications. And I'm saying average, right? It could be very well in be in thousands, depending on size. That's not manageable with manual processes or one-off scripts. So what does SCIM adoption actually requires? On the IDP side, you need an identity provider that supports SCIM provisioning. Your Okta, Entra, Ping, JumpCloud, OneLogin, all of these supports outbound SCIM provisioning to target application. If you haven't really looked into it, go and look at your identity provider and to go look at their SCIM provisioning documentation. On the application side, you need the SaaS vendor to have a SCIM 2.0 endpoint. Then this is increasingly common, right? Slack, Salesforce, GitHub, Zoom, ServiceNow, Workday, Snowflake, Box, Dropbox, Atlassian. Most major enterprise SaaS apps support SCIM today. Actually, you know what? You can use AI. Look at all of the SaaS applications within your enterprise and try to identify how many of them does supports a SCIM 2.0 endpoint. I would say close to 90, if not 100%. The integration itself is usually configured in the IDP. So you provide the SCIM endpoint URL, a bearer token for authentication, and you define attribute mapping, and that's it. Then you test with a few users before you roll it out broadly. Now, it's not zero work. I don't want to minimize the work, but it is dramatically less work than maintaining a custom integration. And when it's done, it largely takes care of itself. I have not seen too many SCIM related on outages, honestly. So, uh, when you're thinking about SCIM in an enterprise context, you are usually dealing with three categories of tools: your identity providers, that push SCIM, your IGA platforms that orchestrate at a higher level, and SaaS applications that receive SCIM. Right. So let's walk through each of these categories so that we can, map it to our current tools ecosystem and who plays in what space. So category one is identity providers with SCIM provisioning. This is what we have been talking about. Uh, these are the systems that sit in the middle that know your users and they push changes to downstream applications. So Okta, arguably the market leader in this space with their unified universal directory, right? Your Microsoft Entra ID and your JumpCloud, OneLogin, even CyberArk identity and ForgeRock, now part of Ping, all are the players in this space. And then category two, your IGA platforms, your SailPoint Identity Now or Identity Security Cloud, your Identity IQ, your Savient. Savient is a strong competitor to SailPoint, and especially or particularly in the cloud native space, Savient has built deep support for SCIM. And it is known for being strong in application access governance, not just infrastructure. We also have IBM security, verify governance, and Omada identity, and then your SCIM service providers, which are the apps, and we have already spoken about them. right? So SCIM 2.0 is a specification and it tells you what should be supported. It does not guarantee that every vendor implementation is complete, correct, or consistent. So in practice, sometimes you will find implementations that support put but not patch, don't implement filtering correctly, have unexpected behavior on delete, don't honor the external ID properly, and things like this. Or could have undocumented rate limits that causes intermittent provisioning failures. This is the practical reality of SCIM. The protocol is solid. The implementations are a mixed bag. Testing your SCIM integration uh, thoroughly, especially around edge cases like deprovisioning and attribute conflicts, is not optional. And honestly, there are tools to help with this. You can use go to skimvalidator.net. It's a publicly available SCIM validator, and Okta publishes a SCIM test suite. If you are a vendor building a SCIM endpoint, running against these test suites before you claim SCIM 2.0 compliance is the responsible thing to do. So, a SCIM is not a silver bullet though. I want to be clear about what it does not do because misunderstanding this leads to failed implementations and disappointed stakeholders. So let me repeat this. SCIM is not a silver bullet. Uh, a SCIM does not handle fine-grained entitlement. A SCIM can tell a system this user exists and belongs to these groups, but it cannot tell a system this user should have read access to this specific folder, but not that one. That level of authorization is application specific and typically has to be handled either by the application itself or by a separate privileged access management layer or a policy based access control layer. SCIM does not handle authentication, and we covered this, right? SCIM is about provisioning. SAML, OIDC, and OAuth handles the authentication and token flows. SCIM and SSO are complementary but not interchangeable. SCIM does not replace IGA for governance. If you need access certification campaign where managers review and recertify who has access to what on a quarterly basis, SCIM alone does not do that. You need an IGA layer on top. SCIM is also not a real-time event stream. SCIM is a polling and push model. The IDP pushes to application, but it's not an event streaming architecture. If you need real-time audit trails of every access event, that's SIEM territory, security information and event management systems. I've also seen that SCIM does not handle privileged accounts well. Service accounts, shared accounts, break glass accounts. SCIM is designed for human user lifecycle mostly. The PAM tools handle the privileged account world. And these two domains are increasingly getting integrated, but they are still distinct. I'm actually very excited about this integration. But understanding these gaps isn't a criticism of SCIM. It's just the reality of how the identity stack is built today. SCIM occupies a very specific, very important layer, and knowing where its edges are helps you design the right overall architecture. So, in closing, SCIM was born from the chaos of enterprise SaaS sprawl, standardized in 2015 as a clean REST and JSON based protocol for managing users and group lifecycle across systems. And now it is table stakes for any serious enterprise identity program. Let me leave you with a few mental model that I have used over the years and that I think capture why SCIM matters. SCIM is the plumbing of the identity house. Nobody frames a house and then admires the plumbing. But try living a house without it. The bathroom doesn't work, the kitchen is non functional, everything you care about falls apart. SCIM is the same. Nobody puts SCIM on their roadmap because it's exciting. They put it on the roadmap because without it, everything downstream gets messy. SCIM turns identity from a snapshot into a continuous thing. Without SCIM, identity is often captured once when someone joins and then slowly it becomes a lie. With SCIM, identity is alive. It changes when the human changes. It reflects reality. And finally, with SCIM is the difference between we trust our IT team to we can prove our access controls. In a world of increasingly rigorous compliance requirements, new SaaS applications being brought into the enterprise every day, and the amount of workload that is there on the IGA team, a SCIM is non-negotiable. It is not glamorous. It cannot be a flashy demo, but you don't get to show someone a SCIM dashboard and have them gasp. But when someone joins your company and has access to everything they need on their first morning, that is a SCIM working. And when someone leaves your company and have every account, even the SaaS applications, all the SaaS applications, every account logged within the hour, that is a SCIM working. That is identity done right. So this is all I know about SCIM. I have now told you everything. That's all. That is all I know. So you know all about SCIM right now, but I also want to discuss a little bit about decision framework of when and how to think about SCIM. But as I look over time, we are a little over 45, 46 minutes up. So let's discuss that in our next episode. We will discuss a decision framework of when and how to think about SCIM. Do let me know what you think about this episode and if it was worth your time. Please give a rating on whatever platform you are on because it really helps, and share it with someone uh, if you think it would help them. Until next time, this is Rohit, your identity navigator.